Okay, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You bet. So today we're going to be talking about multiple load lines on cranes.
Right.
And this deep dive is really curated for people who operate cranes.
Yeah.
People who want to be crane operators and safety people.
Yeah.
People who deal with the risk of crane operation.
Right, yeah.
And big thanks to Safety One Source for helping us put this deep dive together.
Absolutely.
So when we're talking about multiple load lines on cranes, this is something that you really need to have a good grasp of.
For sure. Yeah.
And it's not just for like passing an exam or something. It's for, like real world safety.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And one of the things that really stuck out to me when we were going through the material was that you can never simultaneously lift a load on two separate lines. Like it's forbidden.
Right. Yeah. It's a hard and fast rule. You can't do it.
But why is that? I mean, would it be more efficient to lift two things at the same time?
Well, you have to remember that these things are very dynamic. You've got a lot of forces involved.
Right. And, if you have two loads swinging and one bumps into the other or something like that, you're going to have a very bad day.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so that's why they just say you absolutely cannot do that.
Okay.
And the general rule is that, you can only operate a crane with multiple load lines if you're following the procedures outlined in this volume.
Oh, okay.
As well as any procedures outlined by the crane manufacturer or a qualified person.
So let's talk about this term qualified person for a second, because it comes up a lot and it seems like, it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it's not just like, Joe Blow off the street. This is somebody who has, documented verifiable expertise.
Okay.
Special certifications, lots of experience in the field. They understand crane dynamics really well.
Right.
They can assess risks and make judgment calls under pressure.
Okay.
So it's not just, somebody who can read a book or something like that.
Yeah.
This is a real prep. So it's kind of like the pre-work before you even get to operating the crane with multiple load lines is super important.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this pre-operation checklist is really important, and it goes way beyond just the basic stuff.
Okay.
Like you have to make sure you're using the right load rating chart.
Okay.
Is that based on, what your boom and job configuration is and where your lifting points are and all that.
Right.
You have to verify the individual load weights and the total load, including the rigging.
Okay, so you have to count the rigging.
You have to count the rigging because all that adds up.
Okay.
And then you have to understand, what are the limitations of your crane for like simultaneous drum operation.
So like, what do you mean by that?
Well, can the drums rotate in the same direction?
Okay.
Can they rotate in opposite directions? Are there limits on how many rope layers you can have on tandem drums?
And so all of this is stuff that, if you're studying to be a crane operator, this is something you would be tested on.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're going to get tested on all this stuff. And it's not just for the test, it's for real world stuff too.
Right.
Because if you get out there in the field and you make a mistake, people can get hurt.
Exactly.
So you've really got to know this stuff.
And another thing that stood out to me was that every load line must have an anti-two block device.
Yeah.
So what does that do?
So, I was reading about this incident where an anti-two block device really saved the day.
Really?
So the load block was being hoisted up too high and it was on a collision course with the upper block.
Okay.
And that's really bad because you could snap the line or even topple the crane.
Wow.
But this anti-two block device activated just in time, it brought everything to a halt.
Oh, wow.
And it prevented a major disaster.
So this is one of those things where it's like, it might seem like a small detail, but it can really make a big difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes these little things can really save your bacon.
And another thing that I thought was interesting was that each line has to have a load indicator.
Right. Yeah, that's really important.
Especially if you're dealing with multiple lifting points.
Right,
Yeah.
because you can't always guarantee that every lifting point is going to be able to support the full load.
Yeah.
So those indicators are going to tell you exactly how much weight is being distributed to each point.
Okay.
And that can help prevent overloading and potential structural failure.
So it's kind of like you're constantly monitoring.
Absolutely. You've got to be watching everything all the time.
And also watching out for like any interference between the lines of the rigging.
Right. Yeah. Even a little tangle or snag can create a really dangerous imbalance.
Okay.
So communication between the operator, the lift director, and the rigging crew is super important.
It's a whole team effort.
Absolutely. You can't do this stuff in a vacuum. You
Right.
know, you need everybody working together.
Yeah.
And if you see any sign of interference, you've got to stop operations immediately.
Right.
And then you get a qualified person in there to assess the situation and decide if it's safe to proceed.
Oh, so you don't just like, try to untangle it yourself or something.
No, you don't want to mess around with this stuff.
Yeah.
You need an expert to look at it.
Okay.
And, another thing to keep in mind is side loading limitations.
Okay.
Booms, jibs, and sheaves, they all have limits on how much lateral force they can handle.
Okay.
And those limits are set by the manufacturer for a reason.
Gotcha.
If you exceed those limits, you could damage the structure or even cause the whole thing to collapse.
So, like, what's a good way to kind of like conceptualize this whole thing of operating a crane with multiple load lines?
It's kind of like conducting an orchestra.
Oh, okay.
You've got all these different instruments and they all have their own limitations, and you've got to make sure they're all playing in harmony.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, so just like a conductor needs to be aware of every note. The crane operator needs to be constantly vigilant. They have to anticipate potential problems and respond decisively. It's a big responsibility.
Right.
But ultimately, safety is a shared responsibility.
Yeah.
It starts with knowing your equipment, your regulations, and your team.
Well, this has been a really interesting deep dive. I've learned a lot.
Glad to hear it.
And I want to thank Safety One Source again for putting this all together for us.
Yeah, they do great work.
So for our listeners out there, be sure to check out Safety One Source. They have a lot of great resources and training available.
Absolutely.
And until next time, stay safe out there.
Yeah, be careful.
All right, see ya.
See you later.